I still can't believe this actually happened. What you're about to hear isn't just another wedding story. It's about a man everyone thought was gone. A woman in red who smiled while he lay motionless on cold marble. And a 3-year-old girl, a maid's daughter, who stood in front of hundreds of wealthy guests and screamed the words that stopped a wedding, exposed a secret, and changed 4 lives forever. Stay with me until the end. Because what this little girl did next, nobody in that ballroom will ever forget. Welcome back, my friend. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional, unexpected tales I've ever shared on this channel. A story about love, betrayal, and a child's fearless heart. I promise you this is not what it looks like on the surface. Let's begin. Nobody thought a 3-year-old could see what 40 adults missed. Grand Oakwood Estate, just outside Charleston, South Carolina, was lit up like something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers dripped golden light over 300 guests dressed in silk and tuxedos. Roses, deep red, thousands of them, lined every hallway. Tonight was the engagement celebration of Nathaniel Cole, 33 years old, heir to Cole Industries, one of the wealthiest men on the East Coast, and his fiancée, Victoria Hastings, 29, a woman known throughout Charleston high society for her beauty, her charm, and her carefully practiced smile. Everyone said they were the perfect couple. Nathaniel built his fortune from the ground up after his father passed, turning a struggling logistics company into a billion-dollar empire. Victoria came from old money, the kind of family that summered in the Hamptons and never asked where their wealth actually came from. Together they looked like a magazine cover. But behind closed doors, in the servants' quarters where nobody with a title ever bothered to look, a very different story had been unfolding for almost a year. Rosa Delgado had worked as a live-in maid for the Cole family for 6 years. She was quiet, hard-working, and endlessly kind, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday but whose own name most guests never bothered to learn. Rosa had a daughter, Mia, just 3 years old, with big brown eyes that seemed to understand far more than a toddler should. Mia had grown up in the hallways of Grand Oakwood, playing quietly in corners while her mother worked, watching the world of the wealthy from the shadows. What nobody knew, what nobody could have possibly guessed, was that Rosa wasn't just the help. 8 months earlier, late one rainy night, Rosa had witnessed something in the East Wing hallway that she was never supposed to see. Victoria, believing the house empty, had been on the phone, her voice sharp and businesslike, talking to someone about the timeline and making sure everything looks like an accident. Rosa had frozen behind a linen cart, heart hammering, as Victoria mentioned Nathaniel's name, and the words life insurance, before hanging up and walking away without ever noticing she'd been overheard. Rosa told no one. Who would believe a maid over a woman like Victoria Hastings? She had no proof, only fear. So she watched. She stayed close. She kept little Mia near her at all times, unaware that trouble was already tightening around her family's small, fragile place in that enormous house. Tonight was the night everything Rosa feared had been building toward would finally surface, though even she didn't know how, or when, or that her own daughter would be the one to bring it into the light. The engagement party had reached its peak. Champagne flowed. A live band played soft jazz. Nathaniel stood near the grand staircase, laughing with old business partners, his tailored charcoal suit catching the chandelier light. Victoria floated through the crowd in a stunning crimson gown, greeting guests with practiced warmth, her diamond ring catching every camera flash. Then, just after 8 o'clock, Nathaniel excused himself to grab something from his study, a small velvet box containing a second gift for Victoria, a family heirloom bracelet that had belonged to his late mother. He never made it back to the ballroom. 15 minutes later, a scream echoed from the marble foyer. Nathaniel Cole was on the ground. motionless, ill, not breathing that anyone could tell in the panic of the moment. Guests rushed from the ballroom, gasping, some crying out, phones raised, chaos spreading like wildfire through the estate. Someone shouted for a doctor. Someone else shouted for an ambulance. And in the middle of the swirling panic, Victoria arrived at the top of the staircase and did something no one expected. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She descended the stairs slowly, gracefully, almost as if she were walking onto a stage. And then, in front of 300 stunned guests, Victoria Hastings began to dance. Arms raised, gown flowing, a serene smile spreading across her face as she twirled beside her fiancé's still body, as though the music from the ballroom had followed her out into the foyer just for this moment. Gasps turned to horrified silence. Nobody understood what they were witnessing. Was this shock, madness, or something far darker? That's when a small voice cut through the stunned quiet, high-pitched, fierce, and impossibly clear for a child so young. Don't celebrate his death. He is alive. Every head in that foyer turned. Standing at the edge of the crowd, tiny fists clenched, finger pointed directly at Victoria, was Mia, Rosa's 3-year-old daughter. Her white dress glowing under the chandelier light, her dark eyes blazing with something far older than her years. The music stopped. Victoria's smile froze on her face. And in that frozen, breathless second, nobody in that ballroom had any idea that the true story was only just beginning. A 3-year-old had just accused the most beloved woman in Charleston society, and she wasn't finished. The silence in the foyer was suffocating. 300 guests stood frozen, champagne glasses forgotten in their hands, staring between the little girl in white and the woman in red standing over Nathaniel's motionless body. Rosa pushed through the crowd, horrified, scooping Mia into her arms, whispering frantic apologies. "I'm so sorry, she's just a child, she doesn't understand." But Mia squirmed free, planting her small feet firmly on the marble floor, refusing to be silenced. "She said it on the phone," Mia said, her voice trembling now, tears welling in her eyes but her words steady. "She said make it look like accident. I heard her. Mommy heard her too." Victoria's composed mask cracked for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of panic behind her eyes before she quickly forced a laugh, turning to the crowd. "She's a baby. She's confused. Someone help Nathaniel, please, before this becomes a circus." But something in her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. And several guests, respected people, a judge, a hospital board member, 2 of Nathaniel's oldest friends, exchanged uneasy glances. Because in that moment, before anyone could stop it, Nathaniel Cole's eyes opened. He wasn't dead. He wasn't even truly unconscious. He drew a slow breath, blinked against the chandelier light, and sat up on one elbow, his gaze immediately finding Mia's small, trembling figure across the room. Later, when the full story came out, everyone would understand why Nathaniel had been lying so still on that marble floor, and why he had chosen, of all people, to trust a toddler with the truth. 3 weeks earlier, Nathaniel had begun noticing things that didn't sit right. Small things. A missing folder from his study. A rescheduled doctor's appointment he never made. A prescription bottle in his bathroom cabinet that he didn't remember his doctor prescribing. He'd brushed it off at first. Stress, wedding planning, the demands of running a company. But then one evening he'd found Rosa in the hallway outside his study, pale and shaking, unable to meet his eyes. He'd asked her directly if something was wrong. And after a long, terrified silence, Rosa had finally told him what she'd overheard 8 months earlier, The phone call, Victoria's chilling words, the mention of a timeline and an accident. Nathaniel hadn't wanted to believe it. Victoria was the woman he loved, the woman he'd planned a future with. But the strange missing folder, the unexplained pills, the doctor's appointment he never scheduled, it all began forming a pattern too dangerous to ignore. So Nathaniel had done something drastic. He'd hired a private investigator, quietly, without Victoria's knowledge. And 2 days before the engagement party, the investigator had delivered devastating news. The prescription bottle in his cabinet contained a substance that, combined with the champagne certain to be served that night, could cause cardiac arrest. Slow enough to look natural, fast enough that no one would suspect foul play until it was too late. Nathaniel had a choice. Confront Victoria directly and risk her disappearing before there was proof, or set a trap. He chose the trap. He replaced the tampered champagne bottle earmarked for his glass, wore a discreet heart monitor beneath his shirt, and told only 2 people his plan. His private investigator, stationed outside in an unmarked car, and Rosa, the one person in that entire mansion he now trusted completely. He asked Rosa one simple thing. If anything happened to him tonight, if he collapsed as expected, watch Victoria's reaction closely. Because an innocent woman would panic. A guilty woman would reveal herself. What Nathaniel never planned for was Mia. Rosa had only meant to keep her daughter close, safely out of the way, tucked near the edge of the ballroom. But Mia, curious and fearless as always, had wandered close enough to see everything, including the moment Victoria descended those stairs and began to dance beside a man she believed was dying. A moment so cold, so calculated, that even a 3-year-old understood in her own innocent way that something was terribly wrong. Now, kneeling on the marble floor, staring up at Victoria's pale, panicked face, Nathaniel spoke for the first time since collapsing. His voice quiet but carrying across the silent foyer. Why, Victoria? Just tell me why. Victoria's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time, in front of everyone who mattered to her socially and financially. And as her mouth opened, searching desperately for an explanation, something told everyone watching that whatever came next would be far more shocking than anything they'd witnessed so far. What Victoria said next would silence an entire ballroom. For a long, agonizing moment, Victoria said nothing. Her red gown pooled around her like spilled wine on the white marble as she slowly sank to her knees, not out of grief, but out of the sudden, crushing weight of exposure. Every camera in that foyer, every phone raised moments earlier to capture what guests assumed was a tragedy, was now capturing something else entirely. The unraveling of a lie 8 months in the making. You don't understand, Victoria finally said, her voice cracking, stripped of its usual polished elegance. You don't understand what it's like to grow up with nothing, watching everyone around you inherit fortunes while your own family lost everything to bad investments. I wasn't born into old money, Nathaniel. I married into the appearance of it. My family has been drowning in debt for years. Debt I hid from everyone, including you. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This was the first thread of a truth few had ever suspected. Nathaniel rose slowly to his feet, brushing off his suit. His expression unreadable. So you were going to kill me for money? I was going to save myself, Victoria snapped, some of her old fire returning even now. You have no idea the pressure I've been under. My father's company is bankrupt. My mother sold her wedding ring last spring just to keep the lights on. And here I was, marrying into a fortune I could never touch unless something happened to you first. Because your prenup made sure of that, remember? It was true. Nathaniel's legal team had insisted on an ironclad prenuptial agreement, one that left Victoria with almost nothing in the event of a divorce, but named her as primary beneficiary in the event of his death, an old provision from when their relationship still felt unshakable. A provision Nathaniel had forgotten to update. A provision Victoria had never forgotten. But there was more. As Rosa stood holding Mia close, listening with tears streaming down her face, the deeper layers of the story began to surface. Because Victoria hadn't planned this alone. A commotion arose near the ballroom entrance, and heads turned once more as two men in dark suits, the private investigators Nathaniel had hired, escorted a third man into the foyer. Dr. Alan Whitfield, Victoria's family physician for over a decade, the very doctor who had, unknowingly to Nathaniel, prescribed the exact medication now sitting analyzed in a lab report. He'd been paid, quietly, to write a prescription under Nathaniel's name for a condition Nathaniel never had. The room erupted into stunned whispers. This wasn't panic or desperation. This had been planned, coordinated, executed with disturbing precision. Mia, still nestled in her mother's arms, watched the unfolding scene with wide, solemn eyes, too young to fully grasp the magnitude of what she'd witnessed, but old enough to know that something important, something true, had needed to be said, and she had said it. Nathaniel knelt down in front of the little girl, his voice softening as he addressed her directly, ignoring the chaos around them for just a moment. "You saved my life tonight. Do you know that?" Mia shook her head shyly, suddenly overwhelmed by all the attention, burying her face briefly against Rosa's shoulder before peeking back out. "You did," Nathaniel said gently. "You were the only one brave enough to say what you saw, even when everyone else was too scared or too confused or just didn't want to believe it. That takes more courage than most adults in this room have ever shown." As security quietly began escorting Victoria toward a waiting police vehicle, summoned discreetly by the private investigators the moment the collapse occurred as part of Nathaniel's plan, the full weight of the evening settled over the remaining guests. The perfect couple. The perfect fairy tale. All of it had been an elaborate performance concealing something far darker. But amid the wreckage of shattered trust and exposed lies, something unexpected began to take shape. A bond between a billionaire who had nearly lost everything and a maid's daughter who had refused to stay silent. What happened in the weeks that followed shocked Charleston even more than the engagement party itself. News of the scandal spread like wildfire, not just through Charleston's elite social circles but nationally. Headlines called it "The Ballroom Confession" and "The Toddler Who Exposed a Murder Plot." Victoria Hastings was formally charged with attempted murder and conspiracy, along with Dr. Whitfield, whose medical license was immediately suspended pending investigation. The trial would take months, but the evidence, the tampered champagne, the falsified prescription, the recorded phone call the private investigator had managed to capture as corroborating testimony from a hidden device in Nathaniel's study, was overwhelming. But this story was never really about the courtroom. It was about what happened inside Grand Oakwood Estate in the weeks after that chaotic night. Nathaniel, shaken but alive, found himself unable to stop thinking about Rosa and Mia. Not out of pity, but out of genuine, humbled gratitude. Rosa had risked everything, her job, her family's stability, potentially her safety, by trusting Nathaniel with the truth 8 months earlier. And Mia, a 3-year-old with no understanding of wealth or consequence, had done what none of Nathaniel's wealthy friends, board members, or society companions had managed to do in months of quiet suspicion. She'd spoken the truth without hesitation, without fear of how it might look. One evening, about 2 weeks after the incident, Nathaniel found Rosa in the kitchen, preparing dinner as she always did, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy despite the media frenzy still surrounding the estate. Mia sat at the small kitchen table, coloring quietly. "I've been thinking," Nathaniel said, leaning against the doorway, "about what almost happened. about how close I came to losing everything, and how the two people who saved me were the two people this house probably paid the least and appreciated the least. Rosa looked up, uncertain where this was going. Mr. Cole, you don't owe us anything. You were just watching out for me, when you had every reason to stay quiet and protect yourself, Nathaniel interrupted gently. Rosa, I want to set up a trust for Mia. For her education, her future, anything she needs. And I want you to have a permanent position here, not as staff, but as someone I trust completely. Estate manager if you're willing. With a salary that actually reflects what you're worth. Rosa's eyes filled with tears, overwhelmed, unsure how to respond to a kindness she'd never expected from anyone in that world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. But it was Mia who broke the emotional tension, looking up from her coloring book with the same fearless directness she'd shown that night in the foyer. Are you sad? She asked Nathaniel simply. Nathaniel knelt down beside her small table, considering the question carefully. I was, he admitted. I trusted someone who wasn't honest with me. That hurts. But then I remember that a very brave little girl reminded me that honesty still exists in this world. So I'm not as sad as I could be. Mia smiled, pushing her coloring book toward him. You can color too. And in that small, simple moment, a billionaire kneeling on a kitchen floor, coloring alongside a Maid's daughter who had unknowingly saved his life. Something shifted in Nathaniel that no amount of wealth had ever given him. A genuine sense of what truly mattered. Word of Nathaniel's actions eventually reached the public, not through any press release, but through quiet observations from estate staff who noticed the change. He became known not for the scandal that nearly ended his life, but for the quiet, consistent kindness he extended afterward, funding scholarships for children of domestic workers throughout Charleston, establishing whistleblower protections and personally ensuring that no one who worked for him would ever again feel too afraid or too powerless to speak uncomfortable truth. But there was one more twist still to come, one that would tie the entire story together in a way nobody, not even Nathaniel himself, could have predicted. The final chapter of this story is the one that made headlines fade into something far more personal. 6 months after the trial concluded, with Victoria sentenced to 15 years in prison and Dr. Whitfield facing his own separate charges, Nathaniel organized a quiet, private gathering at Grand Oakwood Estate. Not a lavish party this time. No chandeliers dripping excess, no 300 guests in designer gowns. Just close friends, staff who had become like family, and Rosa and Mia, now permanent fixtures of the household in every meaningful sense. During dinner, Nathaniel stood, tapping his glass gently for attention. The room quieted, and he looked toward Mia, now sitting on Rosa's lap, a little older, a little taller, but with the same bright, knowing eyes. I've spent the last 6 months thinking about courage, Nathaniel began. About how it doesn't come from wealth or status or age. It comes from a willingness to speak the truth even when everyone around you tells you to stay quiet. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. A 3-year-old taught me that, and I don't think I can ever fully repay that lesson, but I want to try. He revealed, to gentle applause and a few tearful smiles, that he had established the Mia Delgado Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting domestic workers and their families across South Carolina, funding education, healthcare, and legal protections for people whose voices, like Rosa's, so often went unheard in households of wealth and privilege. Rosa, overwhelmed, could barely speak through her tears. Mia, now old enough to understand a little more of what was happening, simply hugged Nathaniel tightly when he knelt down beside her, whispering the only words that seemed to matter in that moment. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for making me listen, Nathaniel replied softly. As the story of that night eventually settled into Charleston folklore, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes simplified into a single unforgettable image of a woman dancing beside a dying man while a toddler screamed the truth. The real legacy was something quieter, deeper, and far more lasting. It wasn't about a scandal or a trial. It was about what happens when courage, no matter how small, refuses to stay silent. And so, to everyone watching this story tonight, here is the lesson it leaves behind. Truth doesn't need power, position, or age to matter. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the loudest truth, if only we're willing to listen. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine while writing it, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly means the world and helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. If you're new here, please consider subscribing because we share heartfelt, emotional stories just like this every single week. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that honesty and courage still matter in this world, please share this story with them. Thank you for staying until the very end, and I'll see you in the next story.